Marketplace Morning Report is coming up next, and then in 10 minutes at 9 o'clock, it's the BBC NewsHour on WNYC. Let's check in with London to see what they're working on. London, good morning.
Good morning, WNYC. I'm Tim Franks. On today's NewsHour, aid agencies say they can't deliver anything to Gaza as they've no fuel. We'll look also at the latest deadly raid in the West Bank. That's BBC NewsHour, coming up at 9 on WNYC.
Mid-50s out there right now under partly sunny skies. Partly sunny today and a high all the way up to the mid-60s. Gusty as well. Chance of overnight rain. Cloudy will drop down near 50 again. And then tomorrow, those clouds we'll see, they will clear up. The temperature will fall during the day to the upper 40s and breezy, so it's going to feel chilly. Upper 30s and gusty overnight, and then Sunday, sunny and 51 and breezy. Once again, 55 now.
WNYC is supported by the New York Phil with the return of the 65th Street Session featuring guitarist Corey Wong, Louis Cato, singer-songwriter and bassist Michelle Endegeo cello, and mandolin virtuoso Chris Thiele. November 28th at David Geffen Hall. Tickets at nyphil.org. Netflix presenting May-December from director Todd Haynes. Julianne Moore, Natalie Portman, and Charles Melton star in this dark comedy about a notorious tabloid romance in select theaters on November 17th and on Netflix December 1st.
On the next All of It, Birks are back. The New York Times' Elizabeth Patton explores more than 2 centuries of fashion history behind Birkenstock sandals, and we'll take your calls. Plus, the Brooklyn Museum is hosting a zine fair ahead of its new exhibit, Copy Machine Manifestos, Artists Who Make Zines. We'll speak to the curator. I'm Allison Stewart. Join me for All of It, weekdays at noon on WNYC.
With the government funded for now, there's more time to fight over government funding.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Amazon Business, helping provide a smarter, easier way to get the supplies businesses need to thrive. Amazon Business, your partner for smart business buying. And by Schwab. Schwab offers investors choices like full-service wealth management, self-directed investing options, and trading on Thinkorswim. More at schwab.com.
From Marketplace, I'm Sabri Benishore, in for David Brancaccio. Last night, President Biden signed a bill to temporarily avoid a government shutdown, which would have happened at midnight tonight. But this stopgap measure basically just pushed the real funding battle down the road, including over controversial items like the president's request for more aid to Israel and Ukraine. Marketplace's Nancy Marshall-Genzer has more on that.
President Biden asked Congress last month for about $105 billion in aid for Ukraine, Israel, Taiwan, and border security.
Democrats want aid to Israel. Democrats want aid to Ukraine.
Sarah Binder is a professor of political science at George Washington University. She says for Republicans opposed to more aid for Ukraine,
the price for their votes is immigration reform.
In fact, earlier this year, the House passed immigration legislation. It would have restarted construction on the border wall and made it more difficult for migrants to get asylum in the U.S., non-starters for Democrats. The House also passed a $14 billion aid package for Israel with no money for Ukraine. And now, Binder says,
the ball's definitely in the Senate's court.
A bipartisan group of senators is working on a compromise on immigration that would be included in a broader package of aid for Ukraine and Israel, which could be tacked onto a bigger bundle of spending bills.
That could be in January. That could be in February.
Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says he hopes, quote, we can come to a solution in the coming weeks. I'm Nancy Marshall-Genzer for Marketplace.
Meanwhile, just outside of Gaza, the United Nations says trucks carrying fuel and food aid are stuck at the border with Egypt for a second day, due in part to a collapse in communications networks. The World Food Program said Palestinian civilians face the imminent possibility of starvation. Checking numbers, Dow, S&P, and NASDAQ futures are all up. With the Dow future up 122 points, 0.4%. The yield on the 10-year Treasury is 4.445%.
Marketplace Morning Report is supported by Affinity, provider of the CRM for the private capital relationship economy. Affinity knows who has the best relationship with the right startup. Affinity knows. Learn more at affinity.co/marketplace. And by Fidelity. A dedicated Fidelity advisor can help create a wealth plan for a full financial picture. Investment minimums apply. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC.
So each month we watch a documentary together for what we call Econ Extra Credit. And this month it's a feature film based on real history. Killers of the Flower Moon, actually out in theaters now. Members of the Native American Osage Nation were forced onto land that was agriculturally poor. Could not do a lot with it. Then it turned out there was a lot of oil there. The film tells the story from the 1920s of a reign of terror faced by the Osage people as white Americans tried to extract that oil wealth through exploitation, graft, and murder. At the center of this was a legal concept called guardianship. For more on that, we have got Allison Herrera. She's a senior reporter for the investigative journalism outfit APM Reports, which is owned by the same parent company as Marketplace. She covers Indigenous affairs, and her work can also be heard on the podcast from Bloomberg called In Trust. Allison, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Sabri.
So there is this legal concept of guardianship. People might be familiar with this from the story of Britney Spears after she fought to have her guardian removed a couple years ago. But this is basically somebody else being granted the authority to tell you how you can and cannot spend your money. It has a long legal history, which we see in Killers of the Flower Moon. Can you explain what we see there?
Yes, guardianships stem from this racist, paternalistic policy that was put in place by the federal government in the early 20th century that basically deemed Native people incompetent to run their own affairs and manage their own money. You know, the policy was first implemented ultimately to protect Osages from being exploited by non-Indians, but it ended up not being that way. So in 1912, the United States government passed this law that said Osage citizens who were more than half-blood were deemed incompetent. You may remember a scene from the film Killers of the Flower Moon where Molly Burkhart has to go into the office and she has to read off her allotment number and say incompetent. And so that's basically the system that people operated under.
What kind of legal landscape developed around this?
So that's a really good question. And this goes back to Oklahoma statehood. There was an act that was put in place called the Oklahoma Enabling Act. And what this did was it made a lot of provisions and laws for Oklahoma to enter into the Union. And the act laid out that in matters of Indian affairs, that was to be left between the federal government because of the trust responsibility it has for tribal nations. But shortly after statehood in 1907, you had all of these businessmen, these landowners, cattlemen that lobbied really hard to give local courts and judges in eastern Oklahoma control over probates and wills and estates. And that allowed for, judges to appoint their friends and, family as guardians over these Osages.
So even in death, the access to wealth was kind of diverted legally.
Yes. I mean, I did some reporting about a woman named Lily Morrell Burkhart. She was not related to Molly Burkhart or the Kyle sisters, but this was in 1967. After she passed away, her will went into this lengthy probate in Osage County, and her then divorced husband, Byron Burkhart, was able to claim that he was her common law husband through the courts, and then it was able to get a salary off of her estate. So, I mean, this isn't something that was just in the 1920s. This was even, later in the 60s and 70s.
Allison Herrera is a senior reporter covering Indigenous affairs for the investigative journalism outfit APM Reports. Allison, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sari, for having me on.
You can follow along with Econ Extra Credit by subscribing to our free newsletter at marketplace.org/newsletters. Next month's movie is the 1983 version of Trading Places. And the United Auto Workers have voted to approve a new contract with General Motors, making its workers the first to approve such an agreement. 54.7% of members voted in favor. The contract was more popular among union members at Ford and Stellantis. From APM, American Public Media.